Mark Damazer became chair of the Booker Prize Foundation in June 2020, following 10 years as master of St Peter's College, Oxford. But before that, was a major cultural leader as controller of Radio 4. A history graduate with a long career in news reporting, editing and producing, but largely managed to stay out of it himself. A little known fact about Mark, I found this out actually when we were having dinners together, is that his passion for football, which I knew about, actually once led him to apply for the role of manager of England. I wonder where we'd be now if he'd got it. Maybe he'll tell us. I really look forward to Mark's reflection on the cultural and creative sectors. Mark Damazer.
That's awesome. I didn't get the job. But there'll be a vacancy soon. So Jenny said that she was coming up to 60 and had problems with her hair. I should be so lucky on both counts. It's very nice to be here in a crowded room. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to spend some time reflecting on cultural power, culture and national profile, culture and the economy, and culture and education, and inevitably, given my background, and thank you, Julius, for the introduction, a little bit about culture and the BBC. So you're all here, obviously, because you have some kind of interest. So in one sense, I'm clearly preaching to the converted. But it's worth stepping back and reflecting on some of the more curious features of the UK's cultural and creative landscape. Let me begin at a tangent with the unlikely pair of George Osborne and Angela Rayner. Back in 2012, when George Osborne was Chancellor, he left his office to go to the opera at 4 p.m, to go to Covent Garden. A flurry of articles followed. If it was 4, by the way, it was bad enough. And to make it worse, it was almost certainly Wagner. Off he went. Last year, Angela Rayner, born working class to her fingertips, was photographed at Glyndebourne, the marriage of Figaro. But even Mozart didn't let her off. At Prime Minister's questions shortly after, when she was deputising for Keir Starmer, her visit to Glyndebourne was mocked by Dominic Raab. Raab, not a man with an entirely original turn of phrase, called her out as, of course, a champagne socialist. Now, I put it to you that neither George Osborne nor Angela Rayner would have suffered this mild abuse and contempt if they'd gone to a football match, or if they'd gone to the opera in France, or Germany, or Italy, or Spain, or indeed most advanced economies. Of course, opera is associated with toffs and with money. I should know most of my disposable income has gone to opera one way or another. But that doesn't mean that anyone who goes to the opera is riddled with snobbery, or that it's impossible to enjoy it, really enjoy it as an art form, or that there shouldn't be a collective endeavour by opera houses and others to encourage more people to at least have the chance to experience it and enjoy it. So the criticism of this sort of activity of Osborne and Angela Rayner is a sort of British inverted cultural snobbery. Culture is not always thought of as a plus in the formation of the British psyche. Let's go to the department, which has already been mentioned, the DCMS, Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, just about to lose its digital muscle, but still, for people in this room, an extremely important enterprise. It used to be called Heritage, and they realised that that was a mistake. But where stands the DCMS in the pecking order? Not really very high. It doesn't solve the housing crisis, or the heating crisis, or the eating crisis. It doesn't address the balance of payments gap or reduce hospital waiting lists. Indeed, one incumbent, Stephen Dorrell, this is 1994-1995, who was a clever man, regarded it so openly as a backwater that he seems to have told lobby correspondents that he was dead bored. His strategy of passive, polite apathy bore fruit. He did nothing of note at the department and then got promoted to what he saw as a proper job, Secretary of State for Health. To make matters worse, one of the problems with British public life, and thus the DCMS, is the simply astonishing turnover of people who become secretaries of state or ministers in the department. The expertise comes and goes at a crazy speed. For better or worse, Nadine Dorries lasted a while. Yes. But since 1992, when the department was formed, we've had 22 people occupy the post as Secretary of State at DCMS. And not even Tottenham managers have that short a lifespan. It's not a good thing. You need to stick around to understand the history, the issues, and the people. You need to make judgments. Who in the creative industries is worth listening to? Who am I only obliged to listen to because they shout the loudest? Which civil servants in this department are good and which are not? And indeed, long-term thinking is left to the civil servants because of the merry-go-round of ministers. And some of them are probably very good. The ones I know have been quite good and sometimes very good. But it is a juvenile way to run a Department of State. So let's look at Britain in the round and ask ourselves, not analysing Brexit, what sort of things we are good at, we British are good at, and what we're broadly less good at. And while I trot through the basics, think for yourself of how culture and the creative industries fit into notions of modern Britain, what we think of ourselves in all our complexity, and the way the UK is perceived abroad, which will also be complex, of course, but will, for the most part, have a significant component derived from our cultural and creative endeavours, both historical and, of course, contemporary. So let's do a quick tour d'horizon of the economy. Ignore the ups and downs of the daily news cycle about the economy, one year at the top of the G7 and the other at the bottom, because we started at a low base and jumped back, and vice versa. The outline is clear. We are, at one level, the sixth largest economy in the world. But we are a low productivity economy, and our wealth per head is nowhere near 6 in the world. We are, in fact, about 13th in the European Union. We largely don't invest anywhere near enough in machinery or new plant or cutting-edge technology. We don't have good technical education, a 150-year-old problem. We have some great universities. World-beating, as Boris Johnson, you may remember him, might have put it, were he not using the phrase as guff to talk about so many other things. We are not a manufacturing power. We are not a great exporting power at all. There are, of course, exceptions, but not many. England is a highly centralised country with large geographic disparities, obviously around London and the southeast, with that large pocket of prosperity, as opposed to large swathes of the rest of the country. These geographic disparities are not unique. If you go to Italy south of Rome, you'll discover it, Germany between east and west, but it's still a pronounced phenomenon. Wealth inequality is very large compared to most of Europe. Our health outcomes are poor compared to Northwest Europe. We do not have enough hospitals or doctors, or outcomes are poor. But we have a robust free press, often very rude. We have fair elections. We have the rule of law. We have incorruptible judges. We have a large financial sector, often a boost, a bit less so perhaps after 2008. And we have David Attenborough. We are great at pageantry. That was a tremendous example. Organising a royal funeral is not to be taken for granted, or indeed the Olympics, or indeed the Paralympics. None of that is to be sniffed at. And we have, and this is incredibly important, the English language. It's largely a great blessing. One of the striking phenomena of the World Cup was the number of footballers, note footballers and ex-football managers who paraded themselves into the BBC, Sky and ITV studios, who were born all over the world, whose English was either their second or third language and largely spoke English better than the rest of the studio. So it's made us a little bit lazy, and it's probably harmed our export effort. But nevertheless, it is a fantastic privilege to have English as a language in this country, and it gives huge advantages to those involved in any number of activities, including clearly culture and the creative sector. The English language is probably the core of our soft power, and we've accumulated that soft power over a long period. Think of those universities, palaces, world-class museums, Wimbledon, Stonehenge, Shakespeare, Dickens, the Beatles, the Stones, the Clash, Oasis, Adele, Ed Sheeran, James Bond, video games designers. We're very good at that. And wherever you stand on Gary Lineker, and even the BBC singers, we have the BBC. In short, we are good at culture. We may not be alone. France and Italy, and in its own particular way, America, are not culturally impoverished. But we have names, we have places, we have longevity, we have people, and we have a strong creative economy. Now, what does that mean, creative industries? Industries, and I lift this from the department, industries which have their origin in individual creativity, skill and talent, and which have the potential for wealth and job creation through the generation of and exploitation of intellectual property, which is a little bit of a lumpy definition. But still, creativity certainly exists from people and not simply from formal definitions of industries, but what are the key sectors of the economy that fit the bill? Architecture, crafts, design, film, TV and radio, IT, software, computer services, museums and libraries, music, performing and visual arts, publishing, which is quite a lot, and it's in the room. And that's where, in one way or another, you all intersect. The stats fly around, but by one definition, we may very well have the largest creative sector in Europe. And it's generally the case that the creative sector now grows much faster than the rest of the economy. It's about 115 billion a year when we last measured it. That's 30 times the BBC license fee. 6% of the economy, 7% of all jobs, and financial services is only a bit ahead at 8.5%. It is more than aerospace, life sciences, and the car industries combined. And the creative economy is likely to grow as a proportion of the economy in the next 10 or 20 years. Extrapolating from earlier trends suggests that the creative economy could grow 40% by 2030. The skills obviously involve mixing the technical, the creative, the collaborative, the individually inspirational, interdisciplinary working, entrepreneurship, and so on. And the increasing digitalization of the creative economies has led clearly to a growing need for industries with both creative and technical skills. And now, a resonance of Jenny. I mean, the creative economy is clearly a means of addressing important social and cultural needs. A good creative economy will help a democratic polity express a huge range of experiences. You see yourself in some way, and others can see you. You could therefore argue that a healthy creative economy is a necessary ingredient of social cohesion. As you see yourself, and you see yourself as both distinctive and having some commonality with others. And the stories that you create in the cultural and creative economy leave a deposit. We leave behind stories and artifacts which enable a society to define how future generations will understand us. And the creative industries often clearly create technical innovations, most obviously, but not exclusively, in the IT sector. As you might predict, given what I've already said about Britain, there has been a historic, unequal distribution of these cultural and creative opportunities, of the skills, of the finance, of the entrepreneurship, clustered around London and, yes, to some extent, the southeast. So this is a levelling up point. And we've talked about that already via Hazel's initial talk, and I should talk about that, given that Buckinghamshire is not really associated with levelling up. But it's no good blaming London or trying to cut London down to size. It's palpably, obviously, a question of how to build others up. I endorse the view that more should be done, including more being given to parts of the country where there have been insufficiently solid and rich foundations. And I recall a particular moment. I went to the Tate Modern Extension shortly after it opened about 6 years ago, designed by Herzog de Meuron. Doesn't get much better or pricier than that. Incredibly difficult engineering. Perforated, magnificent brickwork, towering over Southwark. Concrete curves, wide corridors. And this was on top of the incredible success, and hats off to Tate Modern itself at Bankside since 2000. The Tate extension, I found, personal view, was a void, largely lumbering and mundane conceptual art, not remotely Ai Weiwei. I know that's a subjective view, but I found what was there obvious and cynical. So far, so bad. £260 million in 2016, so probably nearer 300 and something now. That money, surely, might have been spent somewhere else, although, of course, a lot of it was philanthropic money. And you don't get queues of people wanting to give money in Burnley or Halifax. And some thought might be given as to whether there should be matched state funding for philanthropists who are prepared to give to the culture and creative sectors in those areas which have not had rich foundations. But it's a very, very large proportion of what the Arts Council spends in a total year for that one building. The Arts Council, as we've heard, were told, instructed by Nadine Dorries and the government, to tilt their spending outside London. I don't object. That was the strategy. And the Arts Council had no choice but to fulfill it. 25 million a year had to come out of London. Hence what appears to me to be the rapid and not very well prepared decision to take the E&O out of London, cut the funding to the Donmar, reduce the money to the South Bank, and so on. But redistribution of this kind, I repeat, I don't object to it as a matter of principle, is a much rougher task when overall expenditure is squeezed, and it is being squeezed. If you have more money, you can divert more of that additional money away from London and the South East. But this was a zero-sum game, or worse. There was good news for arts organisations in levelling up in areas like Blackpool and Stoke and the East Midlands and elsewhere, and I think that is good and right. But overall, it has not been the success that it might have been if the government had a more generous conception of the creative economy and how culture can generate economic benefit. It is true that when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor and Oliver Dowden, one of the Secretary of States for DCMS, when he was there for a minute or two, they launched a cultural recovery fund and a lot of money went into it. And I'd off my hat, 1.7 billion, and it helped institutions get through COVID. Of course, it happened at a time when there was spectacular fiscal loosening. Think furlough and the business guarantee scheme. But it was the right thing to do, and it would be churlish of me to say otherwise. But we are now engaging reverse gear. Spending and subsidy is really only part of the story. It begins with education. It must begin with education. And here the story, I think, is little short of catastrophic. I'll give you some figures for the number of GCSEs taken, and remember that we have a growing population. So the fall in numbers that I'm about to give you is greater in real terms than the headline figure. Arts GCSE down 11% in a decade. That's nothing. Music down 27% in a decade. Drama down 35% in a decade. And top of the pops. And I regard this as so bad as to be almost incredible. Design and technology, 71%. I cheer myself up. At A-level, design and technology is only down 42%. Music is worse at A-level than it is at GCSE, down 40%. Now, there are other measures of whether young people are having access to music, art, drama, speech, ballet. But it's extremely unlikely that anything else going on outside the schools is going to make up for those kind of catastrophic falls in people taking those qualifications. Now, why has it happened? It's connected to Govism, and not, I think, in the way that Michael Gove would have wished it. I know Michael Gove a bit, and I think he's a considerably more complex and interesting phenomenon than often described. But nevertheless, the focus on the EBAC, with its core subjects, English, math, science, and so on, has led schools to harness their resources into those areas and, hey presto, cut out the focus on performance, expression, and some aspects of creativity. The EBAC excludes all arts subjects. It's the bedrock on which a school's Progress 8 score is based, which determines its place in performance tables. And all this against a background of cuts. In the 10 years after 2009, spending per pupil fell by nearly 10% in real terms. And that's not going to be reversed in a hurry, and we all know why. There are now 25% fewer art teachers than there were 12 years ago. And the shift is most obviously pronounced in state schools in deprived areas, where pupils are far less likely to sing in a choir or play in an orchestra. You should be both amazed at this and outraged. Yes, there is now more for some art organisations in levelling up regions, but weigh that up against the loss of opportunity, economic opportunity and human opportunity, and life chances for millions of school children. Independent schools are not bound by these rules or performance tables, and they are free to do what they deem best for their pupils. And I am not here to blame independent schools for their vastly superior arts provision. It's not their fault. The fact that many of them have high-spec theatres and concert spaces is good for them and good for the students and good for the teachers. When I used to go to schools a few years ago, when I was chair of the Oxford Undergraduate Admissions Committee, I was impressed by how much good building had taken place in state schools in the first part of this century. There were excellent halls, there were excellent classrooms, there were excellent corridors, there were excellent kitchens. I was somewhat less impressed by the arts and creative spaces. There were nothing that resembled the sorts of theatre and music spaces you would get in a range of independent schools, which I would also visit from time to time. So this is a moral question as well as an economic one. We are born with various talents. The UK has largely historically defined academic excellence in schools via an academic framework. I am here as a beneficiary. But it cannot be impossible to sustain academic excellence while trying to find talent in other forms across a school. I don't want to exaggerate. It's not that none of this happens, but what we have is not good enough or not systematic enough or not well enough resourced. We have a moral duty to give young people a chance to find out if they are good at painting or singing or acting or dancing or playing any number of musical instruments. And those that have those skills are entitled. It's not a nice to have. They're entitled to have that talent discovered and have it shaped and nurtured and encouraged. Because if you're not given the foundational training, it is extremely hard to find the opportunity later on to develop that talent. So for all the talk about levelling up and redistribution of money, the inability to construct an education system that allows everyone to find their talent and grow it is both economically self-defeating and a scandal. And so to the largest single player in the cultural sector, at least, the BBC, a massive intervention in the media market. The BBC believes, and this is probably right, it contributes about 5 billion a year to the UK creative economy. And remember that Arts Council funding pot per year is about 1/10 of that, possibly a bit less than that. a fraction of the size. And by the way, Arts Council funding is being squeezed in real terms too. The BBC is the largest single investor in original UK content, which reflects the lives and communities of the UK. 5,000 hours of new content every year, 90% original, but original content budgets are down because the license fee is down by around 30% in the last 10 years. BBC original content, 99%, might be 90, made in the UK, 5% for Netflix. The BBC in levelling up, the BBC moved a huge chunk of its operations to Salford long before Channel 4 did so, and long before the slogan levelling up was invented. 50% of the BBC's economic impact is now outside London. It's around about 20% for the rest of the industry. And the BBC has the ability to act as an anchor to drive investment and growth and level up to some extent creative industries across the UK. Big move to Salford saw the number of digital and creative businesses in Salford increase by about 70%. Now, I say this because the BBC is constantly in the news. The BBC, I think, you pay the license fee, 90% for the programmes and 10% for the national amusement when it screws up. But to think of the creative economy and the cultural industries without the BBC is to think of the cultural and creative industries without its biggest single brand, both in the UK and outside. It has already been cut down by 30%. And if you follow the contemporary debate about the BBC, you will see that the auguries are not good. And so in fighting for the sector as a whole, and if I place my main emphasis on education, because I think that is at the root of it, I nevertheless believe that anybody with a serious interest in the cultural and creative economy of the UK needs to take a serious and sustained interest in the welfare of the BBC. So in short, and in conclusion, we are good at this stuff. We are not good at making finished manufacturing goods. That era is largely gone, but we are good at this stuff. We need to be unembarrassed, and we need not to squander it. I mean, it's perfectly clear that people like you are the people who can provide the energy and the commitment and the passion and the expertise and the authority to get things done. And I just want to conclude by saying all power to your elbow.
Mm-hmm.